House elf slaves, goblins banned from using wands, werewolves shunned. Is it just me, or are wizards kind of awful? Voldemort is widely known for his strong hatred of Muggles, essentially believing that any human with non-magical, impure blood is effectively beneath him. And it's primarily due to this belief system that he set his sights on world dominion, believing that the superior species, wizardkind, should rule over everyone else. And while he didn't share this exact sentiment, Grindelwald believed something similar. While he didn't outright hate Muggles, he did firmly believe that they were inferior, necessitating his own belief that wizarding dominion would be for the greater good. And while this quote from his rally is somewhat gift-wrapped in manipulation, it does mostly echo his philosophy. You came because you crave something new, something different. It is said that I hate le non-magique, the Muggle, the No-Maj, the can't spells. I do not hate them, I do not, for I do not fight out of hatred. I believe that the Muggles are not lesser, but other, not worthless, but of other value, not disposable, but of different disposition. Magic blooms only in rare souls. Anyway, my point is this. Both of these men were hell-bent on wizarding dominance because they genuinely believed that wizards were superior. It pushed them to do unspeakable things in the name of what they believed was right, and more importantly, to convince others of the same. And while Voldemort was a little more crass in his presentation, and Grindelwald a little more refined and persuasive, the messaging was still the same. They were spreading hatred. In response, the wizarding world pushed back, condemned it, and assumed a distinctly holier-than-thou position. But what's interesting about this is that wizardkind, the same people who, with the exception of the Death Eaters and Grindelwald's acolytes, fought against these prejudice causes, are a bunch of pompous hypocrites. And while the average witch or wizard loves to act morally superior to Voldemort, when you actually look at their treatment of other beings, it becomes clear that in many ways, they're no better. House elves are bound to lifelong servitude, stripped of autonomy and conditioned to want it. Goblins are denied the right to own the very things they create, leading to centuries of rebellion and mistrust. And werewolves are effectively exiled from society, unable to find work, forced into the margins simply because of what they are. And this isn't even the full list. Today we're diving deep into the topic of wizarding prejudice, taking a closer look at marginalized groups in wizarding society and the most hypocritical group of all, human wizards. Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of Harry Potter Theory. Now, let me quickly clarify that I do not believe the lay wizard is worse than Voldemort or Grindelwald. But for a group of people who seemingly vehemently deny their desire to oppress others, they sure do a lot of oppressing. The marginalization of non-human wizards in the wizarding world is outrageous, and today I'm going to explain why, starting with arguably the most oppressed group of them all, house elves. We're first introduced to the concept of house elves in the Chamber of Secrets, when Harry meets Dobby, the Malfoy family's house elf. Through this introduction, we discover that the upper class of the wizarding world all seem to own house elves, elves who are magically bound to serve their masters and work in servitude for well-to-do wizarding families without compensation. Their tasks range from cleaning to cooking and running errands, all without question. And in the Goblet of Fire, at least the novel version, we're introduced to even more house elves, the ones employed by Hogwarts. One of the most defining traits of house elves is undoubtedly their unwavering loyalty to their masters. They take their role seriously. So seriously, in fact, they're willing to go to extreme lengths to carry out their duties. And if they ever fail to fulfill one of their duties, or are forced to act against their master's wishes, or even think they have, they don't just feel guilt, they physically punish themselves. We see this most clearly with Dobby, who repeatedly injures himself for disobeying the Malfoys, slamming his head into walls, ironing his own hands, physically hurting himself as a form of atonement. And while owning another species as slaves is already well into dangerous territory, what makes this especially disturbing is that it goes beyond simple obedience. It's conditioning. House elves don't choose to serve. They've been magically bound to it, raised within it, and taught that their entire sense of purpose or worth is tied to how well they obey. But at the same time, the relationship between wizards and house elves raises some pretty uncomfortable ethical questions. From the outset, it's clear that the very existence of house elves is built around servitude, with many bound into a form of magical enslavement, passed down from one generation of a wizarding family to the next like inherited property. Now, it's worth mentioning that not everyone has a house elf. In the modern era, it's mostly affluent wizarding families who have had them passed down through generations. But that doesn't mean the general attitude towards them or the passive acceptance of their servitude in any capacity is any less troubling. The most unsettling part about all of this isn't just the system itself, but how widely accepted it is. Most witches and wizards don't question it, they don't challenge it, they don't even really think about it. To them, house elves are just part of the world. And we can see this clearly at Hogwarts, where dozens, if not hundreds of house elves work tirelessly in the kitchens, preparing meals and maintaining the castle behind the scenes, completely invisible to the students they serve. In the series, there's only really one character that actively takes issue with it, and that's Hermione. Whether that's down to the fact that she simply didn't grow up in wizarding society, or is just a better person with a superior moral compass, is unclear. And her disdain for the treatment of house elves eventually pushes her to start SPEW, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. Now, SPEW is an aspect from the books that didn't appear in the films at all, but basically Hermione embarks on a crusade to ensure that house elves, who are heavily mistreated, are saved. She starts SPEW as a way to raise awareness about the mistreatment of house elves and to improve their working conditions. She's compelled to start the society after she sees Winky, an elf who isn't in the films, being treated horribly. You know, house elves get a very raw deal. It's slavery, that's what it is. That Mr. Crouch made her go up to the top of the stadium, and she was terrified, and he's got her bewitched, so she can't even run when they start trampling tents. Why doesn't anyone do something about it? Hermione's advocacy for the rights of house elves is an important subplot in the Harry Potter series, as it shows her compassion and commitment to social justice. But interestingly, no one, not even her closest friends, are receptive to her efforts. Ron laughs it off. Harry, while sympathetic, doesn't exactly jump to her side, and the rest of the student body treats it as a bit of a joke. And it's not because Hermione is wrong, but because she's challenging something that's been normalized for centuries. It's something so deeply ingrained in the wizarding world that even the good characters don't really question it. In fact, the oppression of house elves is so ingrained in society that even the house elves themselves resist her efforts. Many of them are offended by the idea of freedom, seeing it not as liberation but as shame. Winky, in particular, spirals after being freed, unable to cope with a life outside of servitude. In essence, an entire species has been conditioned to the point where they fear freedom. But in spite of this, the wizarding world continues to operate as if nothing is wrong, condemning Voldemort for his beliefs while quietly upholding a system that isn't all that different in principle. Goblins. Next up, we've got the even more vertically challenged cousins of house elves, goblins. Much like house elves, goblins are another group that the wizarding world has historically treated as lesser. Not enslaved in the same way, but certainly not equal. The average witch or wizard had no respect for them. Purebloods outright hated them, and even some of the most progressive members of the wizarding world carried a deep-rooted mistrust toward these small, cunning, humanoid creatures. If we take a look back through the history books, what we find is a long, violent pattern. A series of goblin rebellions, all centered around one core idea, the desire to be treated as equals. But to understand why these rebellions happened, we need to go back even further, because interestingly, goblins weren't always at odds with wizardkind. For much of early magical history, goblins and wizards coexisted in a relatively stable, if uneasy, relationship. Goblins carved out a very specific and important role for themselves within magical society. They were incredibly intelligent, often described as cunning, and exceptionally skilled metalworkers. In fact, they were responsible for crafting some of the most powerful magical objects in existence. The most famous example, the sword of Godric Gryffindor. But even that iconic weapon highlights one of the biggest sources of conflict between goblins and wizards: ownership. To wizards, ownership is simple. If you buy something, it's yours. But to goblins, ownership belongs to the creator. So when a wizard purchases a goblin-made item, the goblin doesn't see it as a sale. They see it as a temporary arrangement, a loan that should be returned upon the wizard's death. Which meant that when wizards refused to return these items, instead passing them down through generations, it was seen as theft. This fundamental disagreement eventually created a deep divide between the two groups, laying the groundwork for systemic mistrust and discrimination. And although the two groups had very different value systems, it was wizards who eventually broke the mold and started treating them like second-class citizens. This in turn bred resentment. resentment that continued to build over time until it finally erupted. Which is exactly why, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, goblins launched multiple rebellions against wizarding authority. What's important to note here is that these rebellions weren't just random acts of violence. They were completely justified reactions to systemic mistreatment. Because despite their importance to wizarding society, despite the fact that goblins literally ran the wizarding economy through institutions like Gringotts, they were still treated as second-class citizens. This manifested in a number of ways. They weren't given representation in the Wizengamot. They were widely mistrusted, and perhaps most significant of all, they weren't allowed to carry wands. Wands, as we know, are everything in the wizarding world. They're the primary tool through which witches and wizards channel magic, essentially the key to unlocking their full magical potential. But for some reason, goblins are forbidden from using them. Under the Code of Wand Use, established in the early 17th century, it became illegal for any non-human magical creature, including goblins, to own or use a wand. And this wasn't just discouraged, it was criminal, punishable by imprisonment in Azkaban. Let's just think about that for a second. Goblins, who are highly intelligent, magically capable, and responsible for managing the entire financial infrastructure of the wizarding world, are denied access to the single most important magical tool in existence, not because they can't use them, but simply because wizards won't let them. Through this very deliberate restriction of their access to wands, and by extension, advanced magical practice, the Ministry effectively prevents goblins from operating independently of wizarding authority. And in practical terms, this creates a clear imbalance. Goblins play a central role in wizarding society, but are still denied the same rights and tools afforded to human wizards. If we zoom out, it becomes pretty clear what's actually going on here. Goblins aren't excluded because they're incapable. They're excluded because they're different. They're trusted enough to run the entire financial system, but not trusted enough to be given equal rights. They're relied on for their intelligence and craftsmanship, but denied the tools that would allow them to operate on the same level as wizards. And this is textbook marginalization. When a group is essential to how society functions, but is still kept at a distance, restricted, and ultimately controlled, there's no clearer form of discrimination. So again, while the wizarding world condemns figures like Voldemort for believing that some beings are inherently lesser, when it comes to goblins, they've quietly built an entire system that reflects that same idea, just in a more subtle, institutionalized way. Werewolves. Unlike goblins or house elves, werewolves aren't a separate species. They're witches and wizards who have been afflicted with a condition known as lycanthropy. There is a reference to werewolf cubs in the books that's a little funky and seems to suggest otherwise, but there's no supporting evidence anywhere in canon that werewolves exist as a separate species rather than infected humans. And despite being human for the vast majority of their lives, they are often completely ostracized from wizarding society. Lycanthropy is a magical affliction that transforms witches and wizards into werewolves during the full moon. Those who suffer from it are referred to as lycanthropes. There are two primary ways to contract it. The most common is through a bite from another werewolf, and the second, less common way is through the lycocomia curse, which doesn't require a werewolf at all. But regardless of how it's contracted, lycanthropy is considered a permanent condition that significantly alters a person's life. There's no known cure, and only the Wolfsbane potion is known to alleviate symptoms. And while the physical changes in someone who has contracted lycanthropy are undoubtedly significant, at least during their transformed state, I think this pales in comparison to the social consequences. The biggest impact of lycanthropy isn't what happens during the full moon. It's how those individuals are treated the rest of the time. Werewolves are widely stigmatized within the wizarding world. As a result, many struggle to find stable employment, maintain relationships, or participate fully in society. In many cases, they're pushed to live on the margins, not necessarily because they want to, but because their condition makes integration difficult. The best example of this is Remus Lupin. Lupin is a good person, intelligent, capable, and highly qualified, but because of his condition, and his condition alone, he spends most of his adult life struggling to find work. The first time that we're introduced to Lupin's character, he's described as follows. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes that had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with grey. It's also strongly implied that he hadn't eaten properly for a while. He was as shabby as ever, but looked healthier than he had on the train, as though he had had a few square meals. and in Order of the Phoenix is further emphasized just how difficult it is for werewolves to find stable employment. I know she's a nasty piece of work though. You should hear Remus talk about her. Does he know her? No, but she drafted a bit of anti-werewolf legislation 2 years ago that makes it almost impossible for him to get a job. J.K. Rowling expanded on this further in an interview. Remus lived a hand-to-mouth existence, taking jobs that were far below his level of ability, always knowing that he would have to leave them before his pattern of growing sick once a month at the full moon was noticed by his workmates. And when Dumbledore gives him a chance and Remus finally finds a good position at Hogwarts, he's forced to resign once his identity as a werewolf becomes public. Over the course of history, the Ministry of Magic has made many attempts to regulate werewolves, including the Werewolf Code of Conduct introduced in 1637. This required werewolves to register themselves and agree to certain restrictions, such as isolating during full moons. A Werewolf Code of Conduct was developed in 1637, which werewolves were supposed to sign, promising not to attack anyone, but to lock themselves up securely every month. Unsurprisingly, nobody signed the code, as nobody was prepared to walk into the ministry and admit to being a werewolf, a problem from which the later Werewolf Registry also suffered. For years, this werewolf registry, on which every werewolf was supposed to enter their name and personal details, has remained incomplete and unreliable, because so many of the newly bitten sought to conceal their condition and escape the inevitable shame and exile. With that many people hiding something just to get by, it's hard to argue that they're being treated as equals. Centaurs. Despite their humanoid traits, centaurs are classified as a distinct species. They are highly intelligent, sentient beings with their own culture, language, and systems of knowledge. In fact, many centaurs are just as, if not more, intellectually sophisticated than wizards, particularly when it comes to subjects like astronomy and divination. But in spite of this, they're not always treated as equals within the wizarding world. Did they face the same oppression as goblins or house elves? Certainly not. But are they still relegated to the fringes of wizarding society? Absolutely. Within the ministry's own classification system, centaurs were initially classified as beings, a category reserved for sentient creatures capable of understanding and participating in magical lore. Sounds good, right? However, the centaurs themselves took issue with this when they realized they were grouped into this classification with creatures like hags and vampires. As a result, centaurs requested to be reclassified as beasts, choosing to separate themselves from that system altogether. And while this decision was partly their own, it still had consequences. Under ministry classifications, particularly Law 15b, centaurs are effectively treated as creatures of near-human intelligence, rather than equals within wizarding society. So even though the shift wasn't imposed on them directly, it still reinforces a system that places them outside of full participation in magical governance. And this lack of participation shows up in a number of ways. For one, centaurs have no representation within wizarding government. They don't sit on the Wizengamot, they aren't involved in ministry decision-making, and they have no real say in laws that may affect them. Instead, they're largely confined to designated territories, most notably the Forbidden Forest, where they're expected to remain separate from wizarding society. And while this arrangement is often framed as mutual, it's worth noting that it still results in physical and political isolation. We also see clear examples of prejudice in how individual witches and wizards treat them. Dolores Umbridge openly refers to centaurs as filthy half-breeds and view them as lesser beings, despite their intelligence and unique species status. Sure, Dolores is a particularly awful human being, but she's really just echoing a sentiment that exists elsewhere in the wizarding world. Not everyone shares it, of course, but it's probably more common than you might think. Even outside of extreme examples like Umbridge, there's a general tendency among wizards to either distrust centaurs or avoid them altogether, treating them as unpredictable or dangerous rather than as equals. They may not be enslaved, they may not be legally restricted in the same way as others, they may not necessarily want to integrate with wizards, but they are still very clearly on the outside looking in. Last up on the list, we've got squibs, or non-magical wizards. By this point, it shouldn't be surprising that even within wizarding society itself, prejudice runs deep. Sure, half-bloods and muggle-borns face bias to some of the more extreme groups, but squibs are almost unanimously stigmatized and treated as lesser. Squibs are, of course, individuals born into wizarding families who possess no magical ability of their own, and while they are still part of the wizarding world by birth, they often find themselves in an awkward and often uncomfortable position within it. Because of this, squibs are often viewed as an anomaly, something that doesn't quite fit. In many cases, they're treated as an embarrassment to their families, particularly among more traditional or pureblood households. We even see this reflected in how squibs are handled at a young age. Instead of being integrated into wizarding education like other magical children, they're often sent away or redirected toward the Muggle world, effectively removing them from the society they were born into. In many cases, squibs are born to two magical parents and grow up knowing nothing but the wizarding world. But despite that, they're still not given the option to attend Hogwarts, and are instead sent to Muggle schools simply because they can't perform magic. And all of this just reinforces the idea that they don't belong. The best example of this is Argus Filch. Filch works at Hogwarts, but his lack of magical ability is a constant source of frustration, and at times, ridicule. He exists within the wizarding world, but never fully as a participant. He can't perform magic, can't properly engage with the same tools as others, and is often treated more as an oddity than an equal. And while his personality certainly doesn't help his case, it's hard to ignore the underlying dynamic. Even within their own ranks, witches and wizards tend to place value on magical ability above all else, and those who fall outside of that, whether by birth or by circumstance, are often pushed to the margins. Not excluded entirely, but never fully included either. And treating someone differently because of their inability to perform magic sounds awfully familiar. And that about sums up the list. Honorable mentions go out to giants and merpeople. What do you guys think? Did I miss any? Let me know down in the comment section below. Also, if you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and to forget to live